The wagon hadn't even stopped rolling when Harlan Briggs opened his mouth. He was standing outside the feed store with two other men, arms crossed, watching the road like he owned it, which, in the way that mattered most in Dry Creek, Kansas, he practically did. When the wagon pulled up from the train depot and Clara Beaumont stepped down onto the main street, Harlan didn't bother lowering his voice. "Lord Almighty," he said. "Elias ordered himself a whole woman." The laughter that followed was the kind that travels. It bounced off the storefront windows, rolled down the dusty street, and reached Clara before she'd even steadied her footing on the ground. She heard it. She didn't flinch, but her hand tightened on the handle of her traveling case, and she lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance exactly, more like someone bracing for weather they'd seen before. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, full-figured, with dark hair pinned under a plain traveling hat, and eyes the color of creek water after rain. She wore a brown dress that had been mended at the hem twice and carried herself with the kind of stillness that only comes from years of learning to take up as little emotional space as possible, even when your body couldn't help but fill a room. Elias Whitmore stood 10 feet away and didn't say a word. He'd been waiting for 20 minutes, hat in his hands, rehearsing the greeting he planned to give. Something decent. Something that didn't sound desperate, even though he was, at least a little. He was 34 years old and had been running the Whitmore Ranch alone for 6 years since his father died, and the silence of the place had started to feel less like peace and more like something slowly closing around him. He had written to the agency in good faith. He'd described himself honestly: medium height, not handsome, calloused hands, a ranch that needed work, a man who needed a partner more than he needed anything else. He had not asked for anything in particular. He had not specified a size or a shape or a look. He had asked for someone capable, someone honest, and someone who wanted to build something rather than inherit something. He had not expected the woman now walking toward him to be the answer to that letter. Not because of the way she looked, because of the way Harlan Briggs was still laughing. Clara stopped in front of him. She was nearly his height. She met his eyes without wavering, and what he saw there wasn't nervousness, it was assessment. She was looking at him the same way he imagined she'd been looked at her entire life, and she had gotten very good at doing it back. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. "Miss Beaumont." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "You made it." Train was late out of St. Louis. She glanced once in the direction of the feed store, where Harlan had finally gone quiet but was still watching. Then she looked back at Elias. "Is there somewhere I can wash up before we talk?" It wasn't the greeting he'd rehearsed for, but it was the first honest thing anyone had said to him in weeks. "Yes," he said. "The wagon's right here." If you had grown up in Dry Creek, you would know that the town had its own way of deciding things. Not through votes or meetings or any formal process, but through the particular consensus of about 12 people whose opinions circulated fast enough to become fact before anyone thought to question them. Harlan Briggs was one of those 12. So was his wife, Meredith, who ran the Women's Social Committee and the informal ledger of who deserved what in this community. So was Pastor Denholm, who kept his judgments wrapped in scripture but delivered them just as sharply as anyone else. By the time Elias's wagon reached the edge of town heading west toward the ranch, 3 of those 12 people had already seen Clara Beaumont step off the depot wagon. By nightfall, all 12 would know. And by morning, the version of Clara they'd collectively constructed would have very little to do with the woman actually sitting on the wagon bench beside Elias, watching the flat Kansas land open up around them. She had a way of sitting that used exactly the space she needed and not an inch more. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She watched the land. "How many acres?" she asked. 340, Elias said. "About 220 of it's usable. The rest is rock shelf along the north side." "Cattle?" 42 head, 1 bull, name of Goliath. He's the problem." Clara turned to look at him. "Problem how?" "Temperamental. My neighbor, Frank Alderton, lost a section of fencing last spring, and Goliath got through. Tore up half his hayfield before we got him back. Frank's been a friend of my father's for 30 years, but he's about done being patient." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What do you do when he gets loose?" "Usually takes 4 men and a lot of rope and somebody gets hurt." She nodded slowly, filing that away somewhere, and went back to watching the land. Elias had imagined this drive 100 times. He had imagined conversation, questions about him, questions about the house. He had imagined nervousness on both sides, maybe a little awkward laughter, the tentative beginning of something. What he had not imagined was a woman who seemed to be doing a quiet inventory of everything around her, cataloging problems, measuring distances, asking exactly the questions that mattered and none of the ones that didn't. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't name yet. "The house needs work," he said, because silence had started to feel like judgment. "I've been meaning to fix the porch railing, and the kitchen stove runs a little hot on the right side, Jay. You have to know it. There's a trick to the back door. I'll show you." Clara glanced at him. "Mr. Whitmore." "Elias, please." "Elias." She said his name like she was testing the weight of it. "You don't have to apologize for your house before I've seen it." I wasn't apologizing. "You were," she said, not unkindly. "It's all right. Most people do." He didn't know what to say to that. So he clicked the reins and they rode in silence the rest of the way. And he tried not to notice that the silence felt different now. Less empty, somehow, than it had on the way into town. The house was a plain two-story frame structure with a covered porch that had lost one of its support posts sometime last winter and leaned to the left like a man favoring a bad knee. The paint was the gray-white color that all white paint becomes eventually on the plains, stripped by wind and sun until it loses any pretense of color. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told Clara something about where Elias's priorities lived, not as a criticism, as information. She stood on the porch step and looked at it all for a long moment. "It's solid," she said. Elias had been braced for something else. He didn't know what, so the plainness of that assessment took him off guard. "The foundation's good," he agreed. "It's just the surface that needs—" "The surface is fine," she said. "I've lived in worse." She said it without self-pity. Just fact. He didn't press her on it. Inside, she moved through the rooms the way she'd ridden in the wagon. Systematic, quiet, taking it all in without commenting on most of it. She noted the low shelf in the kitchen that would work better moved up 6 inches. She noted that the window in the main room faced west, which meant afternoon light. She noted that the upstairs had 2 bedrooms separated by a narrow hall, and she noted with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd learned not to make assumptions that Elias had put fresh linens on the smaller one for her. "Thank you," she said, from the doorway of the smaller room. He was standing at the top of the stairs, hat still in his hand, twisting it slightly. "I want you to know I'll respect your—" He stopped, tried again. "The arrangement is—" "Elias," she turned to face him. "I know what a mail order arrangement is. I've read the agency's terms. You don't have to explain it to me. I just want to be clear that I'm not—" He exhaled. "I don't expect anything you're not willing to give." She studied him for a moment. Not long, just enough. Then she said, "That's good to know. I'll have the same expectation of you." He nodded, and that apparently was that. He went back downstairs and she stood in the small room with its clean linens and its one window facing east, and she set her traveling case on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself take one long breath. She had done this before, walked into a stranger's life, assessed the terrain, found the problems worth solving and the ones to leave alone. She'd spent 4 years keeping house for a widower in Missouri who'd treated her fairly but never once looked at her the way a man looks at someone he's actually glad to have around. She'd spent 2 years before that living with a cousin whose husband's patience ran out in about 6 months. Once he understood that Clara's size was not temporary, not a condition she was working on correcting, not something she was sorry for. She was 31 years old. She was tired of apologizing for existing at full size in a world built for smaller women. She was also, if she was honest with herself, and Clara Beaumont made a practice of being honest with herself even when it wasn't comfortable, she was also hoping. Quietly, carefully, the way you hope for something when you've been disappointed enough times to know better than to say it out loud. She was hoping this time might be different. She didn't know yet if Elias Whitmore was the kind of man who could make it different. But he hadn't laughed when he saw her. He hadn't flinched. He'd said her name correctly and offered her a place to wash up. And when Harlan Briggs had laughed from the feed store steps, Elias had gone very still in a way that didn't look like agreement. That wasn't nothing. She unpinned her hat and set it on the windowsill and went downstairs to see about supper. The kitchen was a disaster by any reasonable standard, but it was an organized disaster, which meant Elias at least knew where things were. Clara found the staples without asking: flour, salt, a side of cured pork, dried beans in a tin canister on the second shelf. She found the cast iron pan hanging on a wall hook and the long-handled spoon in a crock by the stove. She found the trick to the stove's right side by trial and error, running a little hot just as he'd said, and she adjusted. Elias came in from the barn about an hour later, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and stood there for a moment looking at the table where she'd set 2 plates and a breadcloth and a small jar she'd filled with the last of the dried wildflowers from the windowsill because they were there and there was no reason not to use them. He didn't say anything. "Sit down," she said. "It's just beans and cornbread, nothing fancy." He sat. He ate. After about 2 minutes of the kind of silence that comes when a man is genuinely trying to figure out what he's feeling, he said, "This is the first hot meal I've had in this kitchen in 4 months." Clara looked up from her plate. "Why 4 months?" "I had a ranch hand staying through the summer. He cooked. When he left, I went back to eating cold." He paused. "I'm not complaining. I can manage. It's different, eating something that was actually made." Clara nodded once and went back to her beans. After supper, she washed the dishes, and Elias dried them without being asked, and they did it in the same focused, practical silence that had characterized the whole evening. And by the end of it, Clara had begun to revise her assessment of Elias Whitmore upward, slightly, in the private accounting she kept for such things. He wasn't a man who filled quiet with noise. That mattered more than he probably knew. She'd been on the ranch 4 days when she first saw Goliath. He was in the far pasture, separated from the main herd by a split-rail fence that Elias had reinforced twice. He was a massive Hereford bull, rust-red with a white face, broad across the chest and heavy through the hindquarters, with a set to his jaw that Clara recognized immediately as a particular kind of animal stubbornness. Not meanness, but obstinacy. The kind that came from being strong enough that nobody had ever successfully told him no. She stood at the fence and watched him for a while. "Clara." Elias appeared behind her, and she heard the slight tension in his voice. "You shouldn't be so close to that fence." "He's not charging," she said. "He charges when he wants. There's no predicting it." She kept her eyes on the bull. Goliath was watching her too, head lifted, nostrils working. His ears moved in a slow, deliberate rotation. "How long have you had him?" 3 years. My father bought him before he died. He was supposed to improve the line, and he has. His calves are strong. But nobody can handle him." "How do you handle him?" "Mostly we don't," Elias admitted. "When he gets too close to the fence, I send one of the Alderton boys over with a long prod. It takes 3 of us minimum to move him anywhere." Clara watched the bull take 2 slow steps toward the fence, then stop. She stayed still. "What does he do when you use the prod?" she asked. "Exactly what you'd expect. He gets worse." "That's the wrong approach," she said. Elias was quiet for a moment. "I know that, but it's the only one that's ever worked well enough to keep him from getting through." Clara finally turned away from the fence, and Goliath lowered his head and went back to grazing, and she filed that away too. The exact timing of when an animal decides you're not a threat. "He's not aggressive," she said. "He's defensive. There's a difference." "To you, maybe. When he's got 2,000 pounds moving at you, it's hard to hold on to that distinction." "I know," she said, and she said it in a way that suggested she wasn't speaking theoretically. She had grown up on a farm in western Tennessee with a father who ran a mixed operation, a few dairy cows, some hogs, a pair of draft horses, and at various points whatever other animals he'd traded or inherited or been given in partial payment for labor. Her father was not a gentleman by nature, but he was a practical one, and he had learned early that an animal handled through fear produces fear in return, and fear in large animals produces injury and loss. He had taught Clara what he knew, and she had added to it over the years, and what she had learned added up to a kind of patience with animals that she had rarely found she could apply to people, because people were more complicated and less honest about what they were afraid of. She had calmed horses that veterinarians had given up on. She had coaxed a dairy cow through a difficult birth at 3 a.m. in February with no one helping her. She had once talked a boar out of a corner for 45 minutes rather than let her father shoot it, and the boar had eventually walked out calm as weather, and her father had stood there watching and said, without any softness, "Huh," which from him was something close to reverence. None of this had made her popular with the men she'd worked alongside. A woman who was better with animals than you were was one thing. A woman that size who was better with animals than you were was something else, something they didn't have comfortable language for, and so they'd mostly use the language they did have, which was unkind and lazy and usually said under breath or behind back. She was used to that too. What she wasn't used to, and what she noticed with the careful attention she gave to things that were new, was a man like Elias Whitmore, who had watched her stand at the fence with Goliath, and not once suggested she was being foolish. He'd told her she shouldn't be close to the fence because it was true, and he'd have said it to anyone. He hadn't said it the way men usually said things to her, with that particular flavoring of dismissal, that assumption that her body meant her judgment was also imprecise. He'd just said it. And then he'd answered every question she asked. That was the second upward revision in her private accounting. The trouble with Frank Alderton began on the 6th day. Elias came in from the north pasture in the late morning with a look on his face that Claire had already learned to read, tight around the jaw, careful in the eyes, the expression of a man managing something he wasn't going to say out loud until he'd decided what to do about it. She poured him coffee and didn't ask. He sat at the kitchen table and turned the cup in his hands. "Frank came by while you were in the vegetable garden," he said finally. "What did he want?" "To tell me Goliath got through the north fence again last night." Claire set down the pot. "Was there damage?" "Some. One of Frank's storage sheds, the corner of it. Goliath must have scraped against it getting out." He paused. "Frank's not an unreasonable man, but he said this was the 3rd time in 2 years and he can't keep absorbing it." He rubbed the back of his neck. "He said if I can't control the bull, he'll want compensation. And if I can't pay compensation, he'll want to talk to Judge Carey about the property boundary." Clara sat down across from him. "What's the boundary dispute?" Elias looked up. "How did you know there was one?" "There's always a boundary dispute when someone mentions a judge," she said. He exhaled. Almost a laugh. "Not quite. My father and Frank's father ran the fence line themselves years ago. The survey was never formally done. There's about 12 acres on the east side of my property that Frank believes should be his. My father didn't agree. It was never settled because both men were too stubborn to pay for a proper survey and too proud to take it to court. And Frank knows that if Goliath keeps breaking through, you might be in a position where settling that dispute is easier than fighting it." Elias looked at her. "You got there fast." "It's not complicated," she said. "He's using Goliath as leverage. He doesn't actually care about the shed. He might. Maybe a little. But mostly he cares about 12 acres. She paused. "Is the land worth it?" "Those 12 acres have the best water access on either property. There's a spring-fed creek that runs along that border. Whoever owns the land owns the water." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you afford a survey?" "Not this month." "Then we need to keep Goliath from breaking through," she said, "until you can." Elias looked at her across the kitchen table, and something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, but something in the neighborhood. "Clara," he said, "I'm not going to ask you to—" "You didn't ask me," she said. "I'm telling you what needs to happen." She stood and picked up her coffee. "Let me go look at that north fence." The fence was a problem, not in the way a broken fence is a problem. It wasn't broken exactly, but in the way that a fence designed by someone who didn't fully understand what they were containing is always a problem. It was solid enough for ordinary cattle. For Goliath, it was an inconvenience he'd clearly decided, at some point in the past several months, was not particularly worth respecting. Clara walked the line for 40 minutes, studying the ground on both sides, noting where the soil was disturbed, where the posts had shifted slightly in the freeze-thaw of winter. She found the place he'd gone through. Not a break, but a spot where two rails had sprung apart at the top, just enough for an animal with enough bulk and enough determination to push through. And she found about 6 feet from that spot a low patch of ground that told her something. She stood there and looked at it for a while. Then she went and got Elias. "Look at this," she said, crouching at the low patch. The ground was grazed flat, shorter than the grass around it, the soil slightly packed. "He comes here, regularly. This is where he stands." Elias crouched beside her. "He's grazing." "He's not just grazing. Look at the angle." She traced it with her finger. "He's standing here looking at something on Frank's side. See that creek bend?" Elias looked. The creek curved through the Alderton property about 60 yards east of the fence line, cutting a clear bend visible from this spot. "He can see the water," Elias said slowly. "He can smell it," Claire said. "In summer, when the grass gets dry on this side and the water table drops, he can smell that creek. And he's big enough and determined enough that eventually he decides he's going to go find it." Elias straightened up and stood there a moment. "So it's not the fence that's the problem. The fence is a symptom. The problem is he's thirsty and he can smell something better than what he has." She stood up too. "If you dug a small pond on this side, even a clay-lined catchment, nothing elaborate, and kept it filled through the dry months, he'd have no reason to go looking." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Clara waited. She had learned in those 6 days that Elias needed space to think through things, that he wasn't slow, just thorough, and that if you pushed him before he'd finished, he'd dig in out of pure reflex. "That would take time," he said finally. "Yes. And money I don't have right now. Less than you think. The clay's right here in this low spot. That's why the ground's compacted differently. You'd need some labor, a few good days." He looked at her. "You know about clay lining ponds? My father did it twice." She paused. "I helped." He looked at her for another moment, and then he looked back at the fence, and then he looked at the low spot in the ground, and Clara could see him working through something, fitting it into a picture he'd been trying to assemble for years. "All right," he said. "Let's think about how to do this." 1. They did think about it for 3 evenings straight at the kitchen table, with a piece of paper between them that gradually accumulated pencil marks, measurements, rough cost figures. Clara had not been in the business of making herself comfortable in other people's kitchens. She'd been careful about that, careful about the particular trap of making herself too useful too fast, which was its own kind of vulnerability. But the work was real, and the problem was real, and there was something about sitting across a table from a man who was listening to her, actually listening, tracking what she said and building on it rather than waiting politely for her to finish so he could say what he'd already decided. There was something about that which made caution feel like a luxury she could set aside, just for now. She told him about the horses in Tennessee. He told her about the years after his father died, when he'd been too proud to ask for help, and the ranch had suffered for it in ways he was still paying back. She told him about Missouri, the widower, not everything but enough. The part about doing honest work for a man who was fair, but who never once looked at her like she was worth looking at. He was quiet for a long moment after that. Then he said, "I looked at you when you stepped off the wagon." "I know," she said. "Not the way Harlan Briggs did." "I know that too." He nodded, turning his pencil over in his fingers. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. "I'm not a man who says things elegantly." "I've noticed," she said without unkindness. "I just want you to know that the way they looked at you in town, that's not the way I looked at you." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "I believe you," she said. "I wouldn't still be here if I didn't." She went back to the drawing on the paper, and so did he, and neither of them said anything else about it that night, but the room was different after it, warmer somehow, and not from the stove. It was on the 9th day that Goliath got out. Not through the north fence. They'd already done a temporary fix there, 3 new rails and a tighter set on the posts. He got out through the east gate, which Elias had left closed, but, as he would later tell Clara through gritted teeth, apparently not properly latched, because he'd been distracted and in a hurry, and those two things together were the enemy of any gate that relied on a proper latch. Elias discovered it at 7 in the morning when he went to check the herd and found the east gate swinging open and Goliath nowhere in the pasture. He found Clara in the kitchen and told her in a voice that was steady on the surface but had something close to panic running underneath it, because the east gate opened onto the road that ran between his property and Frank Alderton's. And if Goliath was on that road and Frank Alderton looked out his window before they got him back, the conversation about the 12 acres was going to happen a lot sooner than Elias wanted. "How long ago?" Clara asked. "I don't know. He was there at last check yesterday evening." She was already untying her apron. "Which way does the road run? North or south? North toward Frank's, south back toward town." "He'll go north," she said, because she'd spent the past 4 days watching Goliath, and she knew which direction he pointed himself when he stood at the north fence with his nose up. She was already moving toward the door. "Do you have a rope?" "Clara, I'll go." "Get me a rope," she said. Not loudly, just clearly. He got her the rope. They found Goliath a quarter-mile north on the road, standing in the ditch on Frank Alderton's side, his big head down in the dry grass, tail switching. He hadn't made it to the hayfield. He hadn't broken through any of Alderton's fencing. He had apparently just been hungry and curious, and the gate had been an opportunity. Elias pulled up short at the sight of him and said, very quietly, something Clara didn't catch. "Stay here," she said. "Clara, stay here," she said again, and her voice had the same quality it had had when she'd told him to get her a rope. Not a command exactly, more like a statement of what was going to happen. "And don't make any sudden movements." She left him at the edge of the road and walked into the ditch. Goliath lifted his head. His ears rotated toward her. He was facing away from her at an angle, and she moved in a slow arc so that she came around to his left side rather than approaching him straight on. Because a straight approach was a challenge, and she wasn't interested in challenging him. She let him hear her footsteps. She didn't try to be quiet. Quiet was startling. She was just a person walking, steady and even, taking her time. Goliath turned to look at her. She stopped. She stood still and let him look. He was enormous up close. She'd known intellectually that he weighed somewhere around 1,800 pounds, but knowing it and standing 6 feet from it were different experiences. His breath came in slow, heavy pulls. His eyes were dark and large and, at the moment, cautious rather than angry. She could see his nostrils working. She could see the set of his neck, not lowered and locked the way a charging animal prepares, but loose, uncertain. She began talking. Not to him exactly, and not about anything important. She talked the way you talk to fill space without demanding anything in return. Low, even, the sound of a human voice without urgency or fear in it. She talked about the pond they were going to dig. She talked about the creek bend and the clay soil. She told him, in the same tone, that he was a fool for coming out here and that Frank Alderton was going to have something to say about it if he didn't settle down. And she kept walking, slowly, that same arc, until she was close enough. She put her hand on his neck. He didn't move. She held the rope loosely in her other hand and kept her body sideways, never square on, her weight easy on both feet. She scratched, once, at the thick hide behind his ear and felt the muscles under her hand shift as some tension went out of him. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's go home." She worked the rope around his neck. Not a noose, not tight, just a loop and a guide. And she turned and began walking back toward the road, and Goliath, 1,800 pounds of defensive, temperamental, water-seeking bull, walked with her. Elias was standing at the road's edge with an expression Clara couldn't entirely name. It had something in it that looked like relief, and something that looked like awe, and underneath both of those, something else, something quieter that she didn't try to read because she was concentrating on the rope in her hands and the animal walking beside her. She led Goliath back to the gate. She guided him through and closed it properly, both latches, the top and the bottom, and patted his flank once as he walked off toward the water trough. Then she turned around. Elias was behind her. He'd followed the whole way at a distance. He was looking at her with that expression still on his face, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the morning was quiet around them. Just the sound of the cattle in the far pasture and a red-tailed hawk circling somewhere above the tree line. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "My father," she said. and 10 years of paying attention. He nodded slowly. He opened his mouth and closed it again. Then he said, "Thank you." "Don't leave the gate on one latch," she said. "No," he agreed. "I won't." She handed him the rope and walked back toward the house to finish making breakfast. And behind her, she heard him let out a long breath, the kind a person lets out when something they've been bracing for didn't happen, when the catastrophe didn't come, when the morning turned out to be recoverable after all. She thought privately that it was the best sound she'd heard since she'd arrived. She thought something else too, walking back across the dry grass with the hawk still circling, and the smoke starting to show from the kitchen chimney where she'd left the stove running. Something about the way Elias Whitmore had stayed back because she'd asked him to, had trusted her with something he couldn't have controlled himself, had given her the rope without argument, and then stayed out of the way. She thought, this might be it. This strange, broken-fenced, weather-beaten, difficult little ranch in the flat middle of Kansas. This might be the place. Frank Alderton came by 2 days later. He didn't send word ahead, which was his way. Frank was the kind of man who believed that arriving unannounced told you more about a person than any planned visit ever could. He rode up to the Whitmore yard at mid-morning, dismounted at the fence post, and stood there with his hat in his hand in the posture of a man who wanted to appear reasonable but had already decided what he thought. Elias saw him from the barn and came out wiping his hands on a rag. Clara was in the vegetable garden on the south side of the house, close enough to hear if voices carried. They carried. "Elias," Frank said. He was a thick-set man in his 60s, with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 4 decades reading weather. He'd known Elias since Elias was 8 years old. That history was in his voice, the particular weight of someone who feels entitled to speak plainly because they've earned it. "I heard about the East Gate." Elias stopped in front of him. "He didn't make it to your property." "Not that time." Frank turned his hat brim through his fingers. "Word travels, son. You know how this town is." "I know exactly how this town is." Frank glanced toward the house, then back. "I also heard about your arrangement, the woman from the agency." Elias's jaw tightened slightly. "Her name is Clara." "Clara," Frank said it neutrally, without inflection. "People in town are talking." "People in town are always talking." "Yes, but they're talking about this specifically, about—" Frank paused, choosing something. "About whether you've thought this through." "I've thought it through," Elias said. Frank looked at him steadily. "Harlan Briggs said she's—" "I know what Harlan said." Elias's voice dropped half a register. "I heard him say it, and I'll tell you the same thing I'd tell Harlan if he were standing here. What Clara Beaumont is the woman who kept your property from getting torn up 4 days ago. She walked out into that ditch and brought Goliath back on a rope, by herself, without a prod or a second set of hands. So if you've got opinions about her, you might want to decide which ones are worth keeping." Frank was quiet for a long moment. He looked past Elias toward the south garden where Clara had gone still among the bean rows, probably pretending to work. "Is that so?" Frank said. "It is." Another pause. Frank put his hat back on, adjusted the brim. "I came to talk about the boundary," he said, and his tone had shifted, not softer, but recalibrated, the way a man recalibrates when new information has arrived, and he's too practical to ignore it. "I think it's time we got that survey done." "I agree," Elias said. "I'll need until next month to afford my share of it." Frank studied him. "I'll front your share," he said finally. "You can pay me back come fall when you sell." Elias looked like he wanted to argue on principle and thought better of it. "All right." "And fix your gates," Frank said, already turning back to his horse. "Both latches, top and bottom." "Already done," Elias said. Frank mounted, pulled his horse around, and rode back down the lane without looking back. Elias stood in the yard and watched him go, and when the hoofbeats had faded, he turned toward the garden. Clara was standing at the garden fence now, not pretending anything. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Tell him your name?" "Defend me." Elias looked at her. There was something working in his face, not discomfort, more like a man deciding how honest to be. "I didn't do it for you," he said. "I mean, I did, but I also did it because it was true. And because I'm tired of Harlan Briggs deciding what's worth talking about in this town. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Fair enough, she said, and went back to the beans. But she was standing a little straighter. What Clara hadn't told Elias, hadn't told anyone yet, because there hadn't been a reason to, and because she was careful about what she offered before she understood who was going to receive it, was that she had some experience with land disputes. Not her own, her father's. A situation that had played out over 3 years in western Tennessee when she was in her early 20s, involving a neighbor who'd claimed an access road that ran along the western edge of their property was a shared right-of-way when it had never been surveyed as such. The neighbor had been patient about it, the way predatory people are patient, waiting until her father's health declined and then pushing hard at the moment when he was least able to push back. Her father had lost. Not the land itself, but the access, the road, which had made getting their milk cattle to the lower pasture twice as difficult and had quietly, incrementally, broken something in the old man that had never fully healed. Clara had watched that happen. She had watched a patient, methodical wrong accumulate until it became a loss, and she had never fully forgiven herself for not understanding, when she was younger and more inclined toward optimism about people's intentions, what was actually being done. She understood now what Frank Alderton was and wasn't. She thought he was probably a fair man who had decided that 12 acres of water access were more important than being entirely fair, which was a distinction she could work with. She didn't think he was the kind of man who would scheme openly. She thought he was the kind of man who would let circumstances do his scheming for him, which was harder to fight because it didn't look like scheming at all. It just looked like consequences. She thought about this on the 4th evening after Frank's visit, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the survey question turning over in her mind. Elias had gone out to do the last check on the herd. The kitchen was quiet. She had a piece of paper in front of her and was making notes, not decisions, just the shape of what she knew and what she didn't. When Elias came back in, he looked at the paper, and she watched him decide whether to ask or leave it alone. "The deed," she said, before he could decide. "Can I see it?" He looked at her. "Why?" "Because a survey tells you where the line is. The deed tells you where the line was supposed to be." He was quiet for a moment. "You think they might not match?" "I think it's worth knowing before the surveyor gets here." He went to the roll-top desk in the main room and came back with a wooden document box, the kind that sat on shelves in lawyers' offices and in the back of storage trunks in ranch houses all across Kansas. He set it in front of her. "My father kept everything," he said. "I don't know what's in there beyond the deed and the mortgage papers." She opened it. He sat across the table and they went through it together, which was not the most efficient way to do it, but turned out to be the necessary way, because the deed was straightforward. But the third document, a hand-drawn property map from the original land grant, dated 22 years earlier, had something on it that made Clara stop. She put her finger on it. Elias leaned in. The creek bend was marked, and the line, the original line, the one that predated the informal fence his father and Frank's father had run themselves, ran 6 feet east of where the current fence sat. "Your father built the fence 6 feet inside his own property line," Clara said. Elias was very still. "Why would he do that?" "Because he was getting along with Frank's father, and it was easier than running the fence exactly on the line." She looked up. "Which means when Frank says that the land belongs to him, he's measuring from the fence, not from the original boundary. The 12 acres he wants might already be yours, on paper." She turned the document toward him. "A proper survey from this deed description rather than from the fence line would show it." Elias sat back in his chair. He had an expression she'd only seen once before on him, the morning Goliath had walked out of the ditch on a rope. That same combination of relief and something more complicated underneath. "Frank doesn't know this. Frank might not know it, or Frank might know the fence is in the wrong place and has decided that if the survey goes off the fence rather than the deed, he comes out ahead." She paused. "I don't know which, but you need a surveyor who's going to start from the deed, not from the fence." "How do I make sure of that?" "You tell him explicitly, and you bring this map." She set her hand flat on the document. "This has to be there when the survey happens." Elias looked at the map, then at her. "Clara," he said, Don't thank me yet, she said. The survey still has to happen. Frank still has to agree to what it shows. And 12 acres of water access is not something a man gives up easily. I know. He was still looking at her, though. In that way he had that wasn't unkind and wasn't anything she could dismiss, just direct. Like he was seeing her rather than looking at her. I'm not thanking you for the result, he said. I'm thanking you for this. He gestured at the box, the paper, the evening. For caring about it. She looked at the document map and thought about her father and the road and the 3 years it had taken for a patient wrong to become a real loss. I've seen what happens when you don't pay attention to these things early enough, she said. He didn't push her on it. He just nodded and looked at the map with her, and they sat there at the kitchen table for another hour, working through what they knew and what they'd need. And outside the wind was picking up from the north, and the cattle were settling into the nighttime quiet of the pasture. And Clara thought that this specific thing, this working through of a problem together with someone who listened and didn't take over and didn't act like her thinking was a pleasant surprise, this was something she had wanted for longer than she'd admitted to herself. Dry Creek had a women's social committee that met on the first Tuesday of every month at Meredith Briggs's house, which was the largest house in town and was kept in a state of order that said very clearly, this is what is possible if a woman applies herself correctly. Meredith herself was a handsome woman who wore her authority the way some people wear expensive clothing, not exactly comfortably, but conspicuously, so you didn't miss it. Clara had not been invited to the first Tuesday meeting after her arrival, which was not a surprise, but she had heard about it from Nell Purdy, who ran the dry goods counter and had the honest, practical manner of someone who had decided years ago that the truth was less trouble than managing around it. They talked about you, Nell told her. On the second Thursday, Clara came in to pick up a supply order. She said it plainly, without relish. I wasn't there, but Margaret Howell was, and she told me. Meredith suggested that perhaps Elias had made she used the word hasty, decision. Clara set a bag of flour on the counter. What did the rest of them think? Mixed, Nell said honestly. Some agreed. Dolores Carey thought it wasn't anyone's business, but Meredith sets the tone, and most people follow it. What does Meredith want? Clara asked. Nell gave her a look that said she appreciated the directness of the question. Meredith wanted Elias to marry Janet Alderton, Frank's niece. She's been out here from Ohio for 2 years, and Meredith's had her marked for Elias for most of that time. Clara processed this. How does Janet feel about it? From what I can tell, Janet Alderton would rather marry a fence post than Elias Whitmore. But that's not really the point. Nell leaned on the counter slightly. The point is that Meredith put in social effort toward that outcome, and someone else arrived and spoiled it. That's what she doesn't forgive. Not me specifically. Not you specifically, Nell agreed. Although, she paused. Although the particular way she's talking about you isn't kind, and I think you should know that. Clara looked at her steadily. I'm not shocked, she said. No, I didn't imagine you would be. Nell began adding the items to the order slip. For what it's worth, I thought what you did with that bull was something. Earl Pittman saw it from the road. He told half the town. Which half? Clara asked. Nell almost smiled. The useful half. Clara paid for the order and carried it out to the wagon, and she drove back to the ranch thinking about Meredith Briggs and Janet Alderton and the particular arithmetic of small towns. How much of what happened to a person in a place like this was decided not by what they did, but by who had already decided what to think of them before they arrived. She had run that arithmetic in Missouri, too, and in Tennessee before that. She was tired of it, the way you get tired of a recurring pain, not dramatically, just bone-deep tired, the kind of tired that has stopped being surprised. But she was also here, on a bench seat behind 2 working horses on a flat Kansas road with a box of supplies in the wagon bed, and the ranch was over that low rise ahead, and whatever Meredith Briggs thought of her, Elias Whitmore had stood in his own yard and told Frank Alderton her name. That was the arithmetic she chose to keep doing. The social committee problem arrived in a different shape 10 days later when Meredith Briggs came to the ranch herself. It was a Tuesday afternoon, which Clara had begun to understand was Meredith's day for the kind of social call that was actually something else. She arrived in a good buggy with a jar of preserved peaches as a hostess gift, which Clara accepted and set on the kitchen shelf. And Meredith sat at the kitchen table with the posture of a woman who was accustomed to kitchens being impressed by her presence. Elias was out in the north pasture. Clara had known he would be. "It's a nice house," Meredith said, looking around with an expression calibrated just short of the word modest. Elias's mother had more curtains. "I've been focused on other things," Clara said. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her guest because standing would have looked like deference and sitting at the counter would have looked like avoidance. Meredith accepted her cup. "How are you finding it? The ranch life, it must be quite an adjustment." "I grew up on a farm," Clara said. "Oh." A small pause. "Well, this is different country than... You said Tennessee?" "Tennessee, yes." "It's flat here," Meredith said. "Some women find it difficult. The isolation." "Some do," Clara said. Meredith turned her cup in its saucer. "You know, we have a social committee. It would be lovely to have you come to a meeting, the first Tuesday of the month." She smiled in a way that had clearly been practiced for situations like this, warm enough to be irrefutable, but not warm enough to be genuine. "The women here look out for each other." "That's good to know," Clara said. "Elias is well liked," Meredith continued, changing angle. "His family has been here a long time. People feel a kind of responsibility toward him, toward his situation. His situation. A mail order arrangement is..." Meredith paused, choosing. "It's not uncommon. These things sometimes work out very well. I'm sure you're a capable woman." There it was. Clara had been waiting for the place where the social call revealed its actual purpose, and that, "I'm sure you're a capable woman," was it. The verdict dressed up as encouragement, the conclusion placed before any evidence had been examined. "I'm finding my footing," Clara said evenly. "Of course." Meredith set down her cup. "I suppose what I want to say, and forgive me, I'm going to be direct, is that people here worry. Frontier life is hard. It requires a particular kind of..." She didn't finish the sentence. She looked at Clara and let the unfinished sentence do its work. Clara looked back at her. She did not fill the silence with anything defensive. She did not explain herself or her history or her capabilities or her body. She had learned over years that the impulse to defend yourself against an implied accusation was almost always a trap. It confirmed the accusation's right to exist. So she sat and waited, and let Meredith Briggs sit inside the silence she'd created. After a moment, Meredith said, "Well, I just wanted to welcome you." "Thank you," Clara said. "The peaches are lovely." Meredith left 20 minutes later with the expression of a woman who had delivered a message and was not entirely certain it had landed the way she intended. Clara stood at the porch and watched the buggy go down the lane and felt the familiar, tiresome weight of being looked at and not seen. She was still standing there when Elias came up from the north pasture. He saw the fresh buggy tracks and looked at her. "Who came by?" "Meredith Briggs." He slowed slightly. "What did she want?" "To be direct with me," Clara said, "while technically welcoming me." Elias was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "Not much." Clara turned back to the house. "I didn't have to." He caught up with her at the porch steps. "Clara." She stopped. He was looking at her with that direct look again, the one that wasn't quite asking and wasn't quite saying. "Are you all right?" It was a simple question, an ordinary question, and yet it landed somewhere specific because nobody, in the course of this particular conversation or any like it in the past several years, had asked her that. Not after one of these visits, not after one of these structured, polite, unmistakable dismissals disguised as concern. She looked at him. "I've been dealing with women like Meredith Briggs since I was 16, she said. "I know how to sit through it." "That's not what I asked," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Something shifted in her chest, not dramatically, just a quiet shift, like a door moving a quarter inch on a hinge. "I'm fine," she said, "but thank you for asking it." She went inside and he followed, and neither of them said anything else about Meredith. But over supper he asked her about Tennessee in a way that wasn't prying, just interested, and she told him more than she'd intended to, and he listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, without offering premature conclusions. And by the time she'd told him about her father and the road and the long 3 years of watching a patient wrong become a permanent loss, she realized she'd been talking for nearly an hour, and the coffee had gone cold in both cups. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your father's property. It was a long time ago." "Doesn't always mean much," he said. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't." He got up and put the cold coffee on the stove to warm, and she watched him do it. The simple, unconsidered act of rewarming the coffee so they could keep sitting, and thought that there were people you met in your life who surprised you, not with grand gestures, but with small ones, with the kind of ordinary consideration that turned out, on closer examination, to have been missing almost everywhere else. She was adding things to the accounting now that she hadn't had categories for at the beginning. The conversation at the feed store happened on the following Saturday, which was when Elias went into town for supplies, and Clara went with him because she needed thread, and because Nell Purdy had mentioned that the latest supply wagon from Wichita had come in with a fabric shipment, and Clara had been thinking about the curtains. Not for Meredith Briggs's benefit, for her own. They were loading the wagon outside the general store when Harlan Briggs walked out of the feed store across the street with two other ranchers Clara didn't know yet. A red-faced man named Gus Colton and a lean, quiet man named Pete Marsh, who farmed the eastern edge of the valley. Harlan saw them and said something to the other two, low enough that Clara couldn't hear the words, and the way the other two responded, Gus with a laugh, Pete with a slight turn, a way that might have been discomfort, told her what the words had probably contained. Elias hadn't heard. He was tying down the wagon load with his back to the street. Clara had heard enough. She'd heard the register and the shape of it, even if not the specific syllables, and she knew what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. What was different this time was that Elias straightened up and turned around and saw Harlan across the street, and apparently had seen enough in the interaction to understand something of what had happened, because he went very still in the way Clara had come to recognize as his stillness before a decision. "Elias," she said quietly, "I'm just going to—" "Elias." She said it again with a different weight. He stopped. She looked at him. "Don't." I know what he keeps doing," she said. "And you walking across that street and making it a confrontation turns it into something I have to deal with forever in this town. Not him. Me." She held his gaze steadily. "Let it alone." He didn't like it. She could see that. He was not a man who liked letting things alone when he felt they were wrong, which was in certain circumstances a quality she respected. But he was also, increasingly, a man who had decided to trust her judgment, and so he turned back to the wagon and finished tying the load and didn't cross the street. But his jaw was set in that way it got, and when they drove out of town he was quieter than usual. After a while he said, "You've been dealing with people like that your whole life." "Yes," Clara said. "And you just let it go every time?" "I pick my battles." She watched the road. Confronting Harlan Briggs in the street doesn't change Harlan Briggs. It just makes him feel important. The battle worth winning isn't the one in the street. Then which one is it? She thought about the deed in the document box. She thought about the survey Frank Alderton was paying for. She thought about the north pasture fence and the pond they still hadn't dug, and the 42 head of cattle and the 12 acres of water access that might, on paper, already belong to Elias. "The ones that matter in 5 years," she said. He was quiet for the rest of the drive, but when they reached the ranch and unloaded the wagon and she went to put the fabric away, a length of blue-gray cotton she'd found in the shipment that would do for the main room windows, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and said, "Clara." She turned around. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't let it alone because it doesn't bother me. I let it alone because you asked me to." "I know," she said. "That's worth a lot." He nodded and went to see to the horses, and Clara turned back to the fabric and thought about what it meant that he'd said it. Not to make her feel grateful, not to extract anything from the statement, just to make sure she understood where he stood. Because that too was something men did not usually bother with. That too was something she was adding to an accounting that had begun to feel less like a cautious inventory and more like something else. She hung the first curtain that evening. It wasn't perfect. The hem was uneven on the left side, and she'd have to take it down and redo it. But it caught the last of the western light and turned it blue-gray and gold in the main room, and Elias came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway and looked at it. "That's different," he said. "Better or worse?" He thought about it with the seriousness he gave to actual questions. "Better," he said. "Definitely better." She took the curtain down that night and fixed the hem and rehung it before breakfast, and this time it was even, and she stood back and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of something done correctly on the second try, which was, in her experience, how most worthwhile things got done. The trouble that had been building in the background, the kind that doesn't announce itself but accumulates in increments, arrived 14 days later in the form of 3 men on horses at the end of the ranch lane. Elias saw them from the barn. Clara saw them from the garden. She set down her trowel and watched. It was Harlan Briggs and Gus Colton. The third man she didn't recognize, younger than the other two, with the look of someone who'd come along because he'd been told to, rather than because he had his own interest in the matter. Elias came out of the barn and walked to the end of the lane. Clara stayed where she was, close enough to hear, far enough to stay out of it unless it became something else. "Harlan," Elias said, in the tone of a man who is being polite because he has decided in advance to be polite. "Elias." Harlan looked past him toward the house, then toward the garden where Clara was. He didn't make a show of looking at her. He let it be incidental. "We wanted to come check on you." "I'm fine," Elias said. "Ranch is fine." "Good, good." Harlan adjusted in the saddle. "Because there's been some talk about the survey." Elias's posture didn't change. "What about it?" "Frank's a fair man, but some people feel, and I'm telling you this because your father and I went back a long way, some people feel that bringing in a boundary dispute right now, after the incidents with the bull, it looks a certain kind of way." "It looks like a man protecting what's his," Elias said. Harlan glanced at the garden again. It wasn't incidental this time. "Some people wonder if the new perspective around here has been giving you advice." The quiet that followed that sentence was the specific kind of quiet that falls when something has been said that can't be unsaid, and everyone present knows it. Elias looked at Harlan Briggs for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was even in the way that is harder to maintain than raised, and means more. "You rode out here," he said, "to tell me that my wife is giving me ideas above my station. That's not what that's exactly what you said." Elias took one step forward, and he wasn't a big man, but he had the kind of stillness that fills space when it moves. "Clara found something in my own deed box that I'd never looked at closely enough. That's not advice above my station. That's my property, my deed, and my right." He paused. "And if the survey shows what I think it shows, 12 acres of water access come back to this ranch, which is where they belong." Harlan sat with that. Gus Colton looked at his horse's ears. The young man at the back looked like he wished he'd stayed in town. "I'm telling you as a friend," Harlan said, quieter now. "I heard what you told me," Elias said. "You can head back now." Harlan looked at him for another moment, then turned his horse and rode back down the lane, and the other two followed. Elias stood there until the dust had settled, then turned and walked back toward the barn, and on the way he passed the garden fence and stopped. Clara was looking at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said, which was exactly what she'd said after the conversation with Frank, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. "No," he said this time, "I did." She studied his face. He looked tired, and also like a man who had said something he'd been holding for a while and felt steadier for having said it. "They're going to push harder now," she said. "I know." "The survey can't come fast enough." "I know that too." He looked at her across the fence. "Are you all right?" There it was again, that same question in the same register. She thought about what she'd told him the first time, that she'd been dealing with this since she was 16, that she knew how to sit through it. All of that was still true, but she was also standing in a garden on a ranch in Kansas, and a man had just ridden back down his own lane after saying, in front of witnesses, that the water rights belonged to him and the thinking that had gotten him there was his wife's, and he was proud of it. "I'm getting there," she said. He nodded. And he went back to the barn, and she went back to the garden, and the afternoon continued the way it had been before. The cattle in the pasture, the hawk on the fence post at the south corner, the blue-gray curtains catching the last light in the main room window. But something had settled between them in the preceding 10 minutes, some question that had been open since the day he'd stood on a muddy road beside a depot wagon with his hat in his hands, and it had settled the way things do when people stop calculating and start simply being honest about which direction they're facing. Clara picked up her trowel and turned back to the soil, and the October wind came down from the north and moved through the bean rows around her, and she thought, I am going to dig that pond. I am going to fix that fence. I am going to sit through every last women's committee meeting and every sideways look on the main street of Dry Creek, Kansas, and I am going to stay. She had made decisions like this before in her life, but this one felt different, and she knew why. This one, she wasn't making alone. The surveyor arrived on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November, which was the earliest Frank Alderton could arrange it, and also, as it turned out, the worst possible timing for reasons that had nothing to do with the survey. His name was Horace Venn, a spare, methodical man from Wichita who arrived with an assistant and a transit level and a leather satchel full of documents, and said very little beyond what was necessary, which Clara respected. He shook hands with Elias and with Frank, who had ridden over from his property at 8 in the morning, and he asked to see the deed and the original land grant map, and Clara produced both from the document box without being asked, because she'd had them out on the kitchen table since the night before. Venn looked at the original map for a long time. Then he looked at Frank. Frank's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. A subtle tightening around the eyes that Clara noticed and filed away. I'll need to walk the full boundary, Venn said. Both sides. Of course, Frank said. They went out. Elias went with them. Clara stayed at the house, not because she was excluded, but because someone needed to be at the house, and because she'd learned over the preceding weeks that her presence in certain conversations made those conversations more complicated in ways that didn't help Elias. The town would accept conclusions more easily if the man who reached them was the one standing in front of the surveyor. That wasn't fair, but it was accurate, and accuracy mattered more to Clara than fairness when the two were temporarily in conflict. She watched them from the kitchen window, the three men and Venn's assistant moving along the fence line in the cold November light, stopping, consulting the transit, moving again. She made coffee. She checked on the bread she had rising near the stove. She did the things she did every morning and let herself think clearly about what the survey was going to find, because she had studied the map enough times that she was reasonably certain she knew. What she wasn't certain of was what Frank Alderton was going to do about it. They were out there for 3 hours. When they came back, Frank's face was the face of a man who had received information he'd been hoping not to receive and was now making rapid internal calculations about what to do with it. Elias's face was carefully neutral, the way it got when he was containing something he didn't want to show in the wrong company. Venn came into the kitchen and accepted the coffee Clara poured him and spread his papers on the table. He explained the results with the patient, uninvested manner of someone who considered the truth of the survey line to be an entirely separate matter from what the people in the room chose to do about it. The original boundary ran 6 feet east of the current fence along the disputed section. The 12 acres that Frank had been pressing to claim as his were, by the deed description and the original land grant, on the Whitmore side. Venn rolled up his papers and asked Elias if he wanted copies filed with the county clerk. Elias said yes. Venn said he'd have them filed within the week. Frank stood by the kitchen door with his hat in his hands. After Venn and his assistant left, there was a silence in the kitchen that had several different textures in it at once. Elias was standing by the table. Frank was still at the door. Clara was at the counter, not pretending to do anything, just standing still. My father knew, Frank said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a flat-tired statement. Elias looked at him. I don't know what my father knew. He knew. They both knew. Frank put his hat on slowly. They ran the fence the way they did because neither one of them wanted the hassle of an exact line. They were friends. They thought it didn't matter. He paused. And then they both died, and left it to us to sort out. Yes, Elias said. Frank was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to fight the survey, he said. Clara let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. I appreciate that, Elias said carefully. I should tell you, Frank continued, and he looked briefly at Clara before looking back at Elias. I pushed on that boundary because because the fence was where it was, and I assumed. He stopped. I didn't assume dishonestly, but I assumed wrong. He turned toward the door. I'll have my fence adjusted after the first thaw. Elias walked him out. Clara stood in the kitchen and listened to the low murmur of their voices on the porch. Not the words, just the tone, which was the tone of two men who had known each other a long time, finding their footing after something shifted. When Elias came back in, he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. He sat down at the kitchen table, which was not something he did in the middle of the day. He was a man of perpetual motion during daylight hours, always moving between one task and the next. But he sat, and he put his hands flat on the table, and he looked at the space where the deed map had been spread out the night before. My father built that fence 6 feet inside his own land, he said, to make things easier with a neighbor. And Frank's father let him, because they were friends. He was quiet for a moment. And now Frank's going to adjust his fence because a piece of paper said so, and we'll still be neighbors, but it'll be different. Will it be worse? Clara asked. Elias thought about it honestly. I don't know. Maybe for a while. He looked up at her. Is that terrible? That I wanted this and now I'm not sure how to feel about it? No, she said. It means you're not simple. He looked at her for a moment. Then something relaxed in his face, some tension that had been there since October. Clara, he said. She waited. When did you know? About the deed line being different from the fence? The night I looked at the map, the 4th evening. He nodded slowly. You didn't say right away. I needed to be sure, and I needed to understand Frank's angle before I knew what to do with it. She paused. And I didn't know yet how much you'd... She stopped. How much I'd what? She met his eyes. How much you'd trust what I found. He held her gaze with that direct, uncalculating look. I want you to know, he said, that I haven't doubted you once. Not on this, not on Goliath, not on any of it. It was simply said, and it hit simply, the way a true thing does when you've spent a long time around things that weren't quite true. Good, she said. Don't start. The story of the survey spread through Dry Creek the way all things spread through Dry Creek, fast and with embellishment. By the end of the week, Nell Purdy told Clara that the general account had settled on a version in which Elias had discovered an old land grant that overturned Frank Alderton's claim. And in some tellings, Clara featured in it, and in other tellings she didn't, depending on who was telling it and what they felt was worth acknowledging. Harlan Briggs' version, as reported to Clara secondhand by Pete Marsh's wife Lila, who had more goodwill toward Clara than most, was that Elias had been manipulated by a woman who had her own designs on the property. Lila told her this with the apologetic manner of someone delivering news they know is unpleasant, and Clara thanked her for it in the plain, genuine way she had, and Lila looked at her as though this reaction was not what she'd expected. Doesn't it make you angry? Lila asked. I've been angry about versions of this before, Clara said. Being angry doesn't change Harlan's mind. Getting on with things does. Lila was a practical woman, the kind whose hands were always occupied with something, and she had a rancher's direct appraisal of what was useful and what wasn't. She looked at Clara and seemed to be revising something. The Women's Committee meets next Tuesday, she said. I heard. Meredith runs it, but she doesn't own it. Lila paused. I'm telling you that because it might not look that way from the outside. Clara filed that away too. She went to the Women's Committee meeting on the first Tuesday of December. She put on the dress she'd mended twice at the hem and the good brown coat, and she drove herself into town and walked into Meredith Briggs's sitting room with 12 other women, and she sat in the chair Lila saved for her near the window, and she spent 2 hours listening more than speaking and watching who agreed with Meredith because they believed her and who agreed with her because disagreeing was more costly than agreeing. There was more of the second kind than she'd expected. She spoke twice during the meeting. Once to second, a suggestion from Dolores Carey about collecting warm clothing for the families on the east edge of the valley who'd had a bad harvest year. Once to correct a factual error about the county clerk's filing deadline that Meredith had stated wrong. She did it pleasantly and without any particular emphasis, and Meredith accepted the correction with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And Dolores Carey caught Clara's gaze from across the room and nodded once, very slightly, in the manner of a woman who has been waiting for that particular error to be corrected for some time. She drove home in the cold and reported to Elias over supper. He listened. "Are you going back?" he asked. "Every month," she said. He watched her face. "Not because you enjoy it." "Not yet," she said, "but eventually." He considered this with the seriousness he gave to practical decisions. "What's the play?" he asked, and she noticed that he'd started using that word, the play, which was something she'd said once when they were working through the boundary strategy. And she noticed also that he'd started talking about these things as though they were working on them together, rather than as though she were advising him on his own problems. She noticed, and she didn't say anything about it, and she kept that in the accounting too. "Meredith's authority in that room is borrowed," she said. "Half those women would rather someone else set the tone. But nobody wants to be the one who moves first." She reached for the bread. "So I'll keep showing up, and being useful, and being correct when she's wrong, and eventually the room shifts." "You've done this before," Elias said. "Something like it." She paused. "In Missouri. Took about 8 months." 8 months is a long time. "Not for something that lasts," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're planning to be here in 8 months." It wasn't exactly a question, but it had a question's particular weight. She looked at him across the table. The curtains she'd rehung were catching the lamplight, and the kitchen was warm and the bread was good, and she was tired in the specific, productive way of a day that had been useful. "I'm planning to be here a lot longer than 8 months," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then looked at his plate, and she saw him work to keep his expression settled, and she thought that was one of the things she'd come to understand about Elias Whitmore. That the things that moved him most were the things he worked hardest not to show, not out of dishonesty, but out of some deeply held belief that restraint was a form of respect. That showing too much before you were certain was a kind of presumption. She was beginning to think they shared that particular quality, which might, in the long run, be the hardest and most necessary thing they had in common. But the problem with the pond was labor and weather and the closing window of both. They'd been talking about it since early October, and it was now the first week of December, and the ground wasn't frozen solid yet, but it would be, soon, and if they didn't get the clay-lined catchment dug before freeze-up, they'd be waiting until April and spending another spring hoping Goliath's patience held through the dry months. Elias had priced out hiring 2 men for 3 days, and the number was not impossible, but it was tight, and he'd been turning it over with the same expression he wore when he was trying to find a third option that didn't cost as much as the first 2. Clara had been watching this for a week before she brought it up. "Pete Marsh," she said on a Saturday morning. Elias looked up from the harness he was mending at the kitchen table. "What about him?" "Lila told me his east fence needs work, the kind of work that requires 2 people and takes a full day." She poured coffee and sat across from him. "You could offer him 2 days of your labor in exchange for 2 days of his." Elias turned this over. "And the third man?" "Ask Frank." He put down the harness piece. "I'm not going to ask Frank Alderton to dig a pond on my property 2 weeks after a survey told him he had the fence line wrong." "You might be surprised," Clara said. "Frank is a practical man. He lost a boundary claim. He didn't lose a neighbor. Those are different things, and I think he knows it." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Besides, the pond benefits him too. Goliath stops breaking through your fences, and he stops losing storage sheds." Elias was quiet for a long time. Clara knew that quiet by now. It was the thinking quiet, not the reluctant quiet, and it meant she'd said something he was taking seriously rather than looking for reasons to dismiss. "I'll talk to Pete first," he said finally. "That's right," she said. "Build from the easier side." He talked to Pete Marsh that afternoon. Pete said yes without deliberating long, which told Clara that Lila had probably mentioned the conversation already, and that Lila Marsh was more of an ally than Clara had yet had a chance to be grateful for. Elias talked to Frank Alderton 3 days later on a Tuesday when he rode over to check on a shared gate latch, and Frank said, after a pause that lasted long enough to mean something, that he had a free Thursday coming up, and he wasn't doing anything that couldn't wait. The 3 of them dug the pond on a Thursday and a Friday in the first week of December, in weather that was cold enough to see breath and gray enough to be cheerless, but not frozen, and Clara brought food out both days. A midday meal big enough for 3 working men and coffee that she replenished twice. On the first day, nobody talked much beyond the practical. On the second day, there was a tentative conversation about the spring calving forecast that gradually extended into something closer to ordinary, and by Friday afternoon, when the clay was set and the edges were done, and they were standing looking at the rough oval of dug earth that in spring would hold water, Frank said, "It's a good idea," without specifying who had the idea. Elias said, "Clara figured out why he was going for the fence." Frank looked at her across the dug pond. It was the most direct look he'd given her since the day of the survey. "Smart," he said, which was not an apology and wasn't meant as one, but had something in it that Frank Alderton didn't give many people, which was a plain acknowledgement. "Thank you for the help," Clara said. "Both of you." Pete Marsh had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, which told her he'd heard the things Harlan had said in the feed store and had not pushed back on them. She wasn't going to hold it against him. People in a small town took the easiest path available, and the easiest path had not, until recently, included standing up for Clara Beaumont of Tennessee. That path was getting a little wider. That was enough for now. So, it was 10 days before the solstice when Elias got the letter. It came with the Thursday mail that Nell Purdy held at the dry goods counter, and Elias brought it back from town with his jaw set in the way that had stopped meaning something was about to go wrong and started meaning something already had. He handed it to Clara without explanation. It was from a man named Hargrove, who described himself as a land representative, and it was addressed to Elias, and it was polite in the precise, armored way of letters that are trying to accomplish something without looking like they are. It said that Mr. Hargrove represented a party interested in acquiring small and mid-sized ranch properties in the Dry Creek Valley for consolidation into a larger grazing operation, and that the Whitmore property had come to his attention as a possible candidate, and that he would be pleased to meet and discuss terms at Mr. Whitmore's convenience. Clara read it twice. "When did this start?" she asked. "I don't know. I've never heard the name Hargrove. Has anyone else in the valley gotten a letter like this?" "I don't know that either." He sat at the table. "Frank would know. He knows everyone who's bought and sold in this valley in the last 30 years. Is there anyone else you'd trust to tell you the truth about it?" Elias thought. "Nell Purdy. And maybe Dolores Carey's husband. He's on the county land board." "Ask all 3, Claire said, "before you respond to this letter. Don't respond to this letter until you know who else has gotten one and whether anyone's sold." "You think this is more than one letter?" "I think a man who calls himself a land representative doesn't write one letter," Clara said. "I think he writes 20 and sees who bites." She set the letter on the table. "And I think the timing is interesting." Elias looked at it. "What do you mean?" "You just won a boundary survey. You just got your water access. You have improved fencing, a new pond going in, and a working relationship with your neighbor that was almost broken and isn't." She looked at him. "Your ranch just got significantly more valuable than it was 2 months ago, and now someone wants to talk about buying it." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "You think someone in town told him?" Elias said. "I think someone told him something. I don't know who or what exactly." She paused. "Harlan Briggs has opinions about what this ranch should be and who should be on it. That's not the same as knowing he wrote to a land representative. But I'd want to know." Elias was looking at the letter with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not angry, not alarmed, but something colder and more resolute than either. "I'm not selling," he said. "I know you're not. But you need to understand the board before you say that." She met his eyes. "Don't answer this yet. Learn what you can first." He nodded, and the nod had a particular quality. Not the nod of a man deferring to someone who knew better, but the nod of a man who had understood something was right and was committing to it. That difference mattered to Clara, and she was aware that it mattered to her more than she'd admitted, the difference between being deferred to and being agreed with. "I'll ride to Frank's tomorrow," he said. "I'll come," she said. He looked at her. "You sure?" "Frank acknowledged the pond idea on Friday," she said. That means he's decided what to think of me. It's better to move while that's fresh. You calculated that, he said, not disapproving, more like confirming something he'd suspected. I observed it, she said. There's a difference. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. And that almost was something she'd begun to look for in the way you look for a particular star once you've found it once. Not certain it'll be there, but knowing which part of the sky to check. Frank Alderton had gotten a letter. He told them this the following morning, standing in his own kitchen with the same careful neutrality of a man who was processing something in real time. His letter had arrived 2 days before Elias's. It had offered, Frank said, a fair market price, which he stated with the tone of someone who had looked up what fair market meant in current terms and found the number credible. Have you responded? Clara asked. Frank looked at her. The look had changed since Friday, since the pond. It had less assessment in it now, and more of what happened after assessment. No, he said. I've been thinking. Are you considering selling? Elias asked. Frank was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Margaret doesn't want to leave, he said finally. She was born 20 miles from here. She wants to die 20 miles from here. He looked at the window. That's enough of an answer for now. Who else do you know that's gotten a letter? Clara asked. Frank listed 4 names. 3 were smaller operations on the south end of the valley. Families who'd had harder years and might, Frank said carefully, be in a position where a fair market offer was hard to turn down. The 4th name was Pete Marsh. Elias and Clara exchanged a brief look. Has Marsh said anything about it? Elias asked. Pete's practical, Frank said. His east fence needs work. He's behind on his mortgage note from 2 years ago. He's the kind of man who does hard math when he needs to. He paused. I don't know which way he'll go. If Marsh sells, what does that do to the valley? Clara asked. Frank looked at her directly. Marsh's land is between mine and Elias's east boundary. If that land goes to a consolidation operation, we've got a neighbor on 2 sides who's large enough to apply pressure on water rights, road access, everything. He paused. It doesn't happen overnight, but it starts. The kitchen was quiet. So we need to know who Hargrove represents, Clara said, and whether the offer to Marsh is better than what his property is worth. Why would it be? Elias asked. Because sometimes you pay above market for one piece because it's the pin that holds the others in place, she said. If Marsh sells, it gets easier to press Alderton and Whitmore. If Alderton or Whitmore sell first, Marsh becomes less valuable and the pressure comes from a different angle. She looked at Frank. How long has Hargrove been operating in this area? I don't know the name, Frank said, which bothers me because I know most of the land operations that move in this part of the state. He rubbed his jaw. I could write to a man I know at the county recorder's office in Wichita. He'd know if there'd been transactions. How fast can you get an answer? A week? Maybe 10 days? Do it today, Clara said. Frank looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze and didn't soften it, and didn't add anything to it, and he nodded once, with the same brief, plain acknowledgement he'd given her at the pond. Today, he said. Riding back to the ranch, Elias was quiet for a while. The December sky was high and pale and thin, the kind of sky that made the land look larger than usual, and the road was hard under the horses' hooves and their breath made small clouds. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't a question. I know some of it, Clara said. I don't know Hargrove. I don't know who's behind him. That matters. But the structure of it, the way you... He searched for the word. The way you map it out. What affects what? My father lost a road access because he didn't do that, she said. He was a good man and a hard worker, and he didn't understand how one thing led to the next until the next had already happened. She watched the road. I swore when I was 23 years old that I was going to understand how things connected before they connected. Not after. That's why you looked at the deed map the first week you were here. I look at the structure of things, she said, how they fit together, what fails first and what that breaks downstream. She paused. Most people look at the immediate problem. I find the one before it. He rode beside her in silence for a while. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I need to say something and I'm not going to say it elegantly. You never do, she said, without unkindness. He looked ahead at the road, and she could see him working at it the way he worked at things that mattered, carefully, with the specific attention of a man who was afraid of getting something important wrong. When I wrote to the agency, he said, I wrote what I wrote because I was lonely and the ranch needed help, and I thought I was asking for practical things, something to fill the silence, someone to share the work. He paused. I didn't know what I was actually asking for because I didn't know someone like you existed. The horses moved on the frozen road. The pale sky stretched overhead. Claire was quiet for a long moment. She was not a woman who rushed toward things that mattered, and this mattered, and she wanted to be honest rather than quick. I came here because I was out of better options, she said finally, and because I've thought for a long time that what I needed most was just to be somewhere where my work was real and my thinking was wanted. She looked at him. I didn't expect you either. He met her eyes, and she saw in his face the thing he was always working to contain, the feeling that was larger than his usual careful expression could comfortably hold. He looked at the road again. I know we haven't talked about what comes next, he said, about the arrangement and whether you... Elias, he stopped. Ask me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I want this to be real, not an arrangement. I want to... He exhaled. I want to do this properly. I have a ring I made. It's not much. It's something I put together because I wanted to have it when the time felt right. He looked at her. I don't know if this is the right time. I don't know if It's the right time, she said. He reached into his coat pocket. The ring was simple, a band of worked iron from the forge, smooth with a small groove around the center that gave it a shape. Not silver, not anything bought in a shop. Something made by his own hands from what was available. He held it out. She took it and looked at it, and she thought about what it had taken to make something like this, the intention behind it, the quiet, sustained hope, and she put it on her left hand where it fit imperfectly, a little loose at the base, and she looked at it sitting on her finger in the December light on the dry creek road. It's loose, he said. I'll have it taken in at the smithy, she said. There's a woman there who does fine work. She looked at him. Yes, Elias. The answer is yes. He let out a breath that seemed to come from a long way down, and for a moment he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he'd stopped noticing the weight and had just now set it down. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that is not empty, that has something warm and solid running through the center of it, something that neither of them needed to name, because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. The ranch came into view over the low rise, the house and the barn, and the pasture and Goliath in the far corner of the field, enormous and stubborn and entirely unaware of the survey results or Hargrove's letter or any of it, standing with his big head down in the dry December grass, waiting, as he always was, for water that was closer than he knew. Frank Alderton's letter to Wichita came back in 9 days. Clara was in the main room hemming a second set of curtains when Elias came through the door with the envelope in his hand and the look on his face that told her the answer inside was not simple. He set it on the table between them, and she set down the curtains, and they read it together, which was how they did most things now. Not because either of them was incapable of reading alone, but because somewhere in the preceding weeks it had become natural to be in the same room when information arrived. Frank's contact at the county recorder's office was a man named Shelby, who had been keeping track of land transactions in the south central counties for 20 years, and knew the difference between legitimate consolidation operations and the kind of activity that preceded them. His letter was careful in the way of a man writing something he didn't want held against him later, but the facts he included were clear enough. A company called Prairie Consolidated Land Holdings had filed articles of organization in Wichita 4 months ago. It had no history of agricultural operation. Its registered agent was a lawyer named Caulfield, whose office handled 4 other similar entities over the past 3 years, each of which had acquired land in a target area, held it for 18 months, and sold to a railroad or a meatpacking interest at prices 3 to 4 times what had been paid for it. The pattern was consistent. The approach was consistent, letters to smaller ranchers first, then pressure from the flanks once anchor properties were secured. Hargrove was Caulfield's man in the field. He'd operated under 2 other names in 2 other counties. Clara finished reading and set the letter down. Railroad or packing, she said. Does it matter? It matters for who to contact, she said. Railroad land grabs can sometimes be fought at the state level because they require easement approval. Packing interests are harder. They're purely private. She looked at the letter. Did Shelby say anything about which line is coming through? He mentioned the Kansas Western Extension survey from 2 years ago. Elias pointed to the relevant paragraph. They surveyed a route through the south end of the valley, never announced the exact corridor. Clara was quiet for a moment, putting things together. If the railroad extension runs through the south end of the valley, they need water access along the road, stock tanks, water towers eventually. She looked up. They need the creek. Elias said nothing. He was following the same line she was. Your 12 acres, she said. The spring-fed section. That's not just grazing value. That's right-of-way value and water rights value for a rail line. She sat back. Hargrove isn't just buying up ranches to sell to a packing house. He's assembling the corridor. And whoever controls the water in this valley controls the negotiating position with the railroad. Which means your land, Frank's land, and Pete Marsh's land between them are the 3 pieces that matter most. She paused. Pete's east fence borders the most direct route. That's why his letter probably offered above market. Elias stood up and walked to the window and stood there looking at the pasture in the thin December light. I need to show this to Frank, he said. Today, Clara said. And we need to talk to Pete Marsh before Hargrove follows up with him. Pete already knows what he got offered. If the offer's good enough, then we need to know what good enough means to Pete, she said. If it's the mortgage note, maybe there's another way. If it's the fence work, that's solvable. If he's decided he's done with ranching and wants out, then we have a different problem. She stood and reached for her coat. But we don't know yet which of those it is, so we need to ask. They went to Frank first because Frank's was on the way, and because the 3 of them walking into Pete Marsh's yard together would carry a different weight than just Elias showing up alone. Frank read Shelby's letter at his kitchen table with his wife Margaret present, which Clara noted approvingly. Margaret Alderton was a small, direct woman with silver hair and the composed manner of someone who had weathered a great deal without making a production of it. And she read the letter over Frank's shoulder and said, when she'd finished, "Well, that explains Hargrove's timing." "It explains a lot of things," Frank said. He folded the letter carefully and set it down. Harlan Briggs met with someone from Prairie Consolidated last month. The room went very still. Elias looked at him. How do you know that? Because I saw him at the hotel in town on a Thursday afternoon when he had no reason to be at the hotel, and the man he was sitting with had a Wichita address on the card he dropped getting up from the table. Frank's voice was level. I picked the card up after they left. I didn't think much of it at the time. Do you still have it? Clara asked. Frank went to the desk in the hall and came back with a small visiting card. The name on it was Hargrove. The address was a Wichita street. Clara held it between 2 fingers and looked at it. Harlan went to them, she said, or they came to him. Either way, he's been talking to them for at least a month. She set the card on the table, which means whoever is pressing you and Elias from the social side, the campaign against the boundary survey, the visit to the ranch, the things said in the feed store, it's possible Harlan had his own interest in keeping this valley unsettled. An unsettled valley has lower property values, Frank said, and lower resistance to a purchase offer, Clara said. Frank looked at his wife. Something passed between them that didn't need words, the particular communication of 2 people who have been married long enough to run the same calculation simultaneously. All right, Frank said. What do we do? Pete Marsh first, Clara said. Then we need to understand what legal standing we have to contest a coordinated purchase effort if it's being conducted in bad faith. She looked at Frank. Does Judge Carey know any of this? Dolores's husband is a careful man, Frank said. He doesn't like what he doesn't understand, and he doesn't like pressure from outside the county. He paused. If you showed him Shelby's letter and Hargrove's card together, I think he'd be interested. Can you get a meeting with him? Probably. Before the end of the week, Clara said. Frank looked at Elias. There was something in the look that Clara had begun to recognize the look of a man recalibrating, again, who he was dealing with. Not just the woman Elias had brought home from a mail order agency. The woman who'd found the deed line, managed Goliath, sat through Meredith Briggs's committee meeting, and was now mapping a coordinated land grab in his kitchen while keeping her voice at the same pitch as if she were discussing the weather. Before the end of the week, Frank agreed. Oh, Pete Marsh was splitting firewood when they rode in, which Clara read as a good sign. A man splitting wood in the cold was a man who was still thinking in terms of winter. A man who'd decided to sell didn't split wood. He set down the maul when they came into the yard and looked at the three of them with the expression of someone who has been expecting a conversation and has mixed feelings about it arriving. "Pete," Elias said. "Elias, Frank." He looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore." It was the first time anyone other than Elias had called her that. She noted it without showing she'd noted it. "You got a letter from a man named Hargrove," Elias said. No preamble. He'd learned, over weeks of watching Clara, that with a practical man you started at the actual subject. Pete looked at his firewood for a moment. "Word travels." "It does," Elias said. "We need to tell you some things about Hargrove, and then we'd like to know where you stand." They told him. Frank presented Shelby's letter. Clara explained the railroad corridor logic and why Pete's East acreage was the anchor piece. She kept it factual and plain, without trying to make it emotionally persuasive, because Pete Marsh was the kind of man who distrusted emotional persuasion and responded to evidence. He listened without interrupting. When they'd finished, he stood in his yard with his arms crossed and looked at the middle distance for a long moment. "The offer they gave me was 18% above what I'd have put on the property myself," he said. "I know," Claire said. "That's real money." "It is. I've got a note I've been carrying for 2 years and a fence that needs $800 of work I haven't been able to do." He looked at Elias. "That's not secret. You know that." "I know it," Elias said. "So what you're asking me to do," Pete said slowly, "is turn down real money based on a letter from a man in Wichita I've never met, because of a railroad survey that may or may not come through, based on a pattern that happened in other counties." He wasn't saying it belligerently. He was saying it the way an honest man lays out his own position so it can be examined. "Yes," Clara said. Pete looked at her. "And what's in it for me if I do that?" "We're going to Judge Carey before the end of this week with everything we have," she said. "If Hargrove's operation is conducting coordinated bad faith acquisition, there may be legal grounds to challenge it at the county level. That could freeze their ability to close on any purchases until the matter's reviewed." She paused. "Which means the pressure on you to decide quickly goes away. And if it doesn't freeze, if the judge doesn't act, then your property is still here, and the offer from Hargrove will still exist, and you'll make the decision you need to make." She met his eyes. "What I'm asking you for right now is time. Not a decision, time." Pete Marsh looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Frank, then at Elias. "She's something," he said to Elias, not unkindly. "She is," Elias agreed. "How much time?" Pete asked Clara. 2 weeks, she said. "If we haven't made meaningful progress in 2 weeks, you'll know, and you can decide freely." Pete bent and picked up the maul and set it against the splitting block and straightened up. 2 weeks, he said, "and you keep me informed, not after the fact, while it's happening." "Every step," Clara said. He nodded once and went back toward the house, and the three of them rode back down the lane in the cold afternoon, and when they reached the road, Frank said, without particular inflection, "I'll send a note to Judge Carey tonight." "Tell him it's time sensitive," Clara said. "He'll know," Frank said. "Dolores will make sure of it." The meeting with Judge Carey took place on a Friday afternoon in the judge's office, above the county clerk's filing room, which was a small space made smaller by the quantity of books and boxes stacked along every wall. Samuel Carey was a tall man who had run to thin in his 60s, with a reputation for patience and deliberation, and impatience with people who wasted his time. He did not waste their time. He read Shelby's letter, examined Hargrove's calling card, asked 4 precise questions about the land grant map and the survey, and then sat back in his chair with the expression of a man who has encountered something he recognizes. "Caulfield," he said. "I know that name." "From where?" Frank asked. "Because 2 years ago I received a courtesy inquiry from a judge in Reno County about a land consolidation operation that was using similar methods. It didn't develop into anything actionable at the time, but I kept the correspondence." He looked at Clara. "You laid this out. What exactly are you asking for?" Clara had thought about this carefully on the ride over. She had been specific with herself about what was realistic and what was wishful, because asking for too much was as dangerous as asking for too little. "A formal inquiry to the county recorder into any undisclosed land option agreements that may exist between Prairie Consolidated Land Holdings and any Dry Creek Valley property owners," she said. "If such agreements exist and haven't been disclosed to other parties affected by them, that creates a potential fraud question. At minimum, the inquiry itself slows the process. Hargrove can't close quietly if there's a county inquiry open." Carrie looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since the letter arrived." "Have you had legal training?" "No," she said. "I've had experience watching people lose things they shouldn't have lost." He considered that. "A formal county inquiry requires my signature and the county attorney's concurrence. Walt Gibson is the county attorney, and he is not historically a man who moves fast on anything." He paused. "However, if I explain to Walt that there may be railroad right-of-way implications, because Walt Gibson lost a cousin's farm to a railroad easement in 1871 and has not forgotten it, he may move faster than is his custom." Elias said, "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes with conditions," Carrie said. "I want anything else you have in writing. Letters, dates, names. If Harlan Briggs was meeting with Hargrove before the letters went out to property owners, I want to know the date of that meeting and whatever Frank can reasonably attest to about what he observed." Frank nodded. "I can write that up today." "Do it." Carrie stood, which was clearly his signal that the meeting was over. He shook hands with Elias and Frank. He paused at Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you were prepared for this meeting." "I try to be prepared for things that matter," she said. "A useful quality," he said, and there was nothing in it that was condescending. It was the plain tone of a man acknowledging a fact the way he acknowledged all facts, with neither excess nor decoration. She shook his hand and they filed out, and on the stairs Frank said quietly, "Dolores is going to be very pleased with herself for bringing Carrie into this early." "She should be," Clara said. "She was right to." Kitchen. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way that the preceding months had sometimes been dramatic. They were the harder kind of work, the persistent, unglamorous, incrementally effective kind. Clara wrote up a timeline of every interaction with Hargrove's network that she could document, from the arrival of the first letter through the meeting with Pete Marsh, and Elias signed it, and it was submitted to the county inquiry. Frank submitted his attestation about Harlan Briggs in the calling card. Pete Marsh, true to his word, held. Hargrove sent a follow-up letter to Elias in the 3rd week of December that was notably less cordial in tone than the first. Not threatening, but with an undertone of impatience that Clara read as a sign that the timeline they were operating on was real and that someone, somewhere, was being pressed for results. "They're on a schedule," she told Elias. "What kind of schedule?" "Railroad surveys have survey windows. If you want to negotiate favorable right-of-way pricing before the route is officially announced, you need to control the land first. Once the announcement is made, the landowners know what they have and the price goes up." She folded Hargrove's letter and set it with the others in the document box. "They need to close before spring. That's why the follow-up letter has a different feeling. So we just need to hold until spring. We need to hold long enough for the county inquiry to become a matter of record," she said. "After that, any purchase they make is made with a cloud on it. That makes it harder to sell to the railroad at the premium they're expecting." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Harlan," he said, "if what Frank attested is accurate, Harlan Briggs has been actively helping them do this." "Yes, to his own neighbors." "For money," Clara said, "or for some arrangement we don't know about yet." She paused. "Harlan isn't the plan. Harlan is a convenience. When this falls apart, and it's going to fall apart, The people who matter will walk away, and Harlan will be left holding whatever agreement he signed with them. That's his problem, Elias said. Yes, Clara agreed. It is. But she watched Elias's face when he said it, and she could see that he didn't say it with satisfaction. He said it the way a man says something that is true and uncomfortable, that involves a neighbor he'd known for years doing something that couldn't be excused and had to be accepted as what it was rather than explained into something easier. That was not simple, and the fact that Elias didn't make it simple, didn't reach for anger or righteousness to make it feel cleaner than it was, that was something. She was still adding things. The accounting had long since stopped being cautious. Quotes. Christmas came and went quietly. Clara made a meal with what they had: a roasted bird, dried apple preserve she'd put up in October, the last of the good flour from November's supply run. Elias had gone to the smithy in town and had the iron ring adjusted, and on Christmas morning he gave it back to her properly fitted, and she put it on and it sat level and secure, and she held her hand flat for a moment looking at it, and he watched her do that with the expression he was getting better at allowing to show. Still plain, he said. I like plain things, she said. I know, he said. That's the only reason I wasn't embarrassed giving it to you. She looked at him. You were embarrassed anyway. A little, he admitted. They ate the meal and washed the dishes, and in the evening he read aloud from a book he'd had since his father's time, a collection of frontier accounts that he'd read so many times he could have recited most of them from memory, but that he read aloud anyway in the slow, careful way that told her reading aloud was something he didn't do for others, had not done for others in a very long time. She sat by the repaired porch lamp he'd brought inside against the cold and hemmed the last of the curtains and listened and thought about the house and what it was becoming compared to what it had been when she'd arrived in October, and about what it might be by next October and the October after that. She was thinking in multiples of years now. She'd stopped thinking in weeks sometime around the day of the survey without quite noticing the shift. The county inquiry generated its first result on the 8th of January. Walt Gibson, who had, as Judge Carey predicted, moved faster than his custom upon hearing the words railroad easement and Reno County, had submitted a formal records request to the state land office in Topeka, and the response had returned a document that Walter brought to Carey's office on a Tuesday morning, and Carey sent word to Elias, who brought Clara, who arrived to find Frank already there, and Pete Marsh in the corner chair with his hat on his knee. The document was a land option agreement. It had been signed 4 months ago, the same month Prairie Consolidated filed its articles of organization. It named, as the grantor, a party who had agreed to facilitate access to properties in the Dry Creek Valley in exchange for a finder's fee upon successful acquisition of 3 or more contiguous parcels. The grantor's name was Harold Briggs. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Pete Marsh let out a long breath through his nose. Frank looked at the window. Elias looked at the table. Clara looked at the document. Is this enforceable? She asked Carey. Not in the way they intended, Carey said. A finder's fee agreement for facilitated land acquisition is legal in itself, but the question is what Briggs did to facilitate it. If he actively suppressed information about the properties, about the survey results, about the water access, about anything that would have affected the seller's decisions, that moves into a different category. He paused. And the fact that this agreement predates the letters to property owners means Harlan was party to the plan before any of you were approached. That's material non-disclosure at minimum, given that he's your neighbor and a member of this community who sits on the town road committee. He votes on road access and property boundary matters, Elias said quietly. He does, Carey said. He voted in November to delay the resurfacing of the East Road, Pete Marsh said from his corner. Everyone looked at him. That road runs past my east fence. If it's in bad shape, my property looks less connected than it is. I always thought that vote was about budget. Maybe it wasn't just about budget. The room was quiet, with the particular quality of people absorbing something they'd suspected but hadn't confirmed. What happens to Harlan? Elias asked. Carey folded the document carefully. That depends on what Walt Gibson decides to pursue, and what a review of the road committee records shows. It also depends on whether Prairie Consolidated decides to cut their losses and retreat from this county, which I expect they'll consider once they know we have this agreement in hand. He looked around the room. The immediate practical effect is that their acquisition strategy in this valley is now a matter of county record. Any purchase they attempt here will be examined, and Hargrove, who has used at least 2 other names in other counties, is going to find Dry Creek considerably less convenient than he expected. Pete Marsh stood up. He was a man of few words who chose them deliberately, and when he spoke now, he looked at Clara rather than at Elias, which was itself a thing worth noting. "You said 2 weeks," he said. "It's been 3.5. "I know," Clara said. "Thank you for the extra time." "It was worth it," he said. He picked up his hat and put it on. "I'm going home to look at my east fence." Frank stood too. He shook Carrie's hand, then Elias's, and he looked at Clara and said, "Your father taught you well." She thought of the road, the 3 years, the loss that had never fully healed. "He taught me what not to do," she said. "I figured out the rest." Frank nodded once and left, and Carrie excused himself to speak with Gibson, and Elias and Clara walked out into the cold January street alone for the first time since October, when she'd stepped off the depot wagon, and he'd been standing there with his hat in his hands, not knowing what was arriving. The street was the same. The feed store, the general store, the hotel where Harlan Briggs had met with Hargrove on a Thursday afternoon. The same flat Kansas sky overhead, the same winter light on the same wooden storefronts. But it was different, and they both knew it, and neither of them felt the need to say so. Elias took her hand, not dramatically, just reached over and took it the way you reach for something you've decided belongs within reach. She let him, because it did, and they stood there on the street for a moment before walking back to the wagon. "Meredith Briggs is going to have a very difficult spring," Clara said. Elias made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was closer to one than anything she'd heard from him in January. "She is," he said. "I'm not glad about it," Clara said. "Aren't you, even a little?" She thought about Meredith's sitting room, and the practiced smile, and the deliberate unfinished sentence, and the "I'm sure you're a capable woman." She thought about Harlan on the steps of the feed store the day she arrived, the way his voice had traveled across the street before she'd even found her footing on the ground. "Not in the way that feels good," she said honestly. "In the way that feels like something was finally true." Elias looked at her. "That's a distinction most people wouldn't make." "Most people have simpler feelings than me," she said. He squeezed her hand once, and they walked back to the wagon, and the ring on her finger was level and fitted and cold in the January air, and the road home ran straight and clear ahead of them across the flat Kansas land, and Goliath was waiting in the pasture with a clay-lined pond going in on the south side, and 12 acres of water access that belonged, now and on paper and in county record, to the Whitmore Ranch. Some things you earn through a single moment of courage. Some things you earn through weeks of sitting at kitchen tables and reading old documents and showing up to committee meetings and saying the right thing at exactly the right time and staying when it would have been easier to go. Clara Beaumont had never believed much in the first kind. She had spent her whole life practicing the second. She was still practicing. She intended to keep doing it for a very long time. Prairie Consolidated Land Holdings withdrew from Dry Creek County on the 14th of February. There was no announcement, no letter of explanation. Hargrove simply stopped responding to the county inquiry, and when Walt Gibson sent a formal correspondence to the Wichita address on the calling card, it came back undeliverable. The company's registered agent, Caulfield, filed a dissolution notice with the state land office the following week, and that was the end of it. Not with any confrontation or climax, just the quiet administrative collapse of something that had counted on nobody paying close enough attention. Clara heard about it from Nell Purdy on a Thursday morning in town, and she stood at the dry goods counter and felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a load you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped registering the weight. She thanked Nell, collected her supplies, and drove home. She told Elias over supper. He set down his fork and was quiet for a moment. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. He picked up his fork again. She picked up hers. They finished the meal in the comfortable silence of people who no longer need noise to fill the space between them. And afterward he washed the dishes while she dried, which was the reverse of how they'd started. And neither of them had ever discussed the change. It had simply occurred somewhere in the long middle of winter, rearranging itself into something that fit better. Harlan Briggs resigned from the town road committee in March, before the county attorney's review of the committee records was complete. The resignation was framed in the brief notice posted at the general store as a matter of personal business demands. Walt Gibson continued the review regardless, and what it found, 3 deferred votes on road maintenance affecting properties Hargrove had targeted, was added to the county record without ceremony. No charges were filed. Walt Gibson told Judge Carey that the evidence established bad judgment and compromised interests more clearly than it established criminal intent, and Carey, who was a man who distinguished carefully between the two, accepted that assessment. Harlan Briggs remained in Dry Creek. He had a farm and a wife and a position that had contracted somewhat, and he managed it in the way people manage diminishment when they have no other option, by reducing his radius, speaking less in public, finding the smaller version of himself that fit the space he now occupied. Clara saw him occasionally at the general store or on the main street, and she didn't avoid him and she didn't seek him out. And he looked at her the way people look at someone who has defeated them without ever directly confronting them, which is a particular kind of uncomfortable recognition that has no clean name. She didn't feel sorry for him. She also didn't feel the satisfaction she might have expected to feel, which told her something about what she'd actually been fighting for. It had never been about Harlan. It had been about the ranch, and the water, and the 12 acres, and the ability to stand on her own land without the ground shifting under it. The Women's Committee shifted in April, which was earlier than Clara had predicted, and came from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. Dolores Carey was the one who moved first. She arrived at the May meeting, Clara's 7th consecutive attendance, and proposed that the committee's charitable coordination for the coming year include the Eastern Valley families who'd lost ground in the drought. And she referenced, without making a performance of it, that Clara Whitmore had already made 2 supply deliveries to the Hendricks family on her own initiative that winter. The room received this the way rooms receive information that rearranges a previously held position, not dramatically but perceptibly, like a shift in a weather pattern that changes which way the smoke leans. Meredith Briggs said very little for the rest of that meeting. She was present at the June meeting and the July meeting, always precisely dressed, always carrying the practiced social manner that had served her for 20 years. But the room had tilted, and she knew it, and Clara watched her understand it without any pleasure beyond the plain, honest satisfaction of something that had taken a long time and a great deal of patience finally reaching its natural conclusion. The pond held water from the first spring melt in March. Goliath found it on the 4th day of April, stood at the edge of it for a long time with his big head down and his nostrils working, and then drank from it, and Elias watched this from the north fence rail with an expression that was somewhere between relief and the quiet vindication of a man who has done a difficult thing correctly. Clara stood beside him. They didn't say anything about it. They didn't need to. The spring calving went better than the previous 2 years combined, which Elias attributed partly to the herd's improved water access, and partly to having someone who checked on the cattle at intervals he'd previously missed because he'd been doing everything alone. He said this plainly, without embellishment, the way he said most things, and Clara received it the same way. Not as a compliment exactly, more as an accurate accounting, which meant more to her. Frank Alderton adjusted his fence line after the first thaw, as he'd promised. He did it himself with one hired man and didn't make anything of it, and when the work was done, he rode over and told Elias it was finished, and they stood at the new line together, and Frank said, "Your father would have gotten there eventually." Elias said, "Maybe." And Frank said, "He would have. He was stubborn, but he wasn't wrong about things that mattered," which was the closest Frank Alderton came to an apology for the pressure he'd applied in the fall, and Elias accepted it for what it was, which was enough. Pete Marsh repaired his east fence that summer with Pete's own labor and Elias's 2 days in exchange, as agreed. He also, at some point that Clara couldn't precisely identify, began stopping by the ranch on occasional afternoons when he was passing. Not for any particular reason, just to talk about cattle prices or the summer grass or the late rains. He drank coffee at the kitchen table and said little but said it plainly, and Clara thought this was, in Pete Marsh's language, a form of gratitude and friendship combined. And she made enough coffee and didn't make anything of it. By midsummer, the Whitmore Ranch was carrying 48 head, 6 more than it had in October. The water access from the 12 acres kept the east pasture usable through the dry weeks of July and August, when other operations in the valley were already rotating stock. Elias made decisions about the fall sale that were different from what he would have decided a year ago. More confident, less reactive, based on better information about what the ranch could actually sustain. Clara had a hand in that, not because she told him what to decide, but because they talked through things at the kitchen table the way they had since November, with the map or the ledger, or sometimes nothing at all between them, just two people thinking out loud in the same direction. She was not always right. There was a decision in June about rotating the south pasture that she'd pushed for, and that turned out to be a month too early, and the grass didn't recover the way she'd expected. And she told Elias plainly that she'd miscalculated the timing, and he said, "We'll rotate it back," without making anything of it. And they did, and it recovered. These were the moments that told her more about the texture of a partnership than the successful ones did. Not whether you got it right, but what happened when you didn't. They were married formally in July, in a small ceremony at the county clerk's office, with Frank and Margaret Alderton as witnesses, and Nell Purdy present because Nell had become, in her dry and practical way, the closest thing Clara had to a friend in Dry Creek, and a friend deserved to be there. Dolores Carey came too, uninvited but welcomed, and brought a jar of honey from her own hives, which Clara set on the kitchen shelf next to the jar of preserved peaches Meredith Briggs had brought in October. And she kept both of them there because both of them, for different reasons, were part of the record of how this had gone. There is a particular thing that happens when a person who has spent their life being underestimated finally stops waiting to be correctly seen and simply goes about the work of being themselves, fully, consistently, without apology. It doesn't produce a single dramatic moment of recognition. It produces instead an accumulation. A surveyor who confirms what you found in an old document box. A neighbor who stops mid-stride to say your father taught you well. A room full of women that tilts incrementally on its axis. A man at the kitchen table who reaches for your hand not as a gesture, but as a habit. Clara Beaumont had understood for most of her adult life that the world would not make space for her. She had understood this not as a grievance, but as a condition, the way you understand weather or terrain, something to be accounted for rather than argued with. What she had not entirely understood until Dry Creek was that the space could be made. Not demanded, not taken, not proved for dramatically, but made, incrementally, practically, through the sustained daily pressure of showing up and doing the work, and being correct about things that mattered, and sitting through things that were uncomfortable, and staying when the easier thing would have been to go. She thought about her father sometimes. The road, the 3 years, the loss that had happened partly because he'd trusted that fairness was the natural condition of things, rather than something that had to be built and maintained. She had not made the same mistake, and she was grateful for it, and she was also, in the quiet and private way of someone who has processed grief over a long time, sorry that he hadn't had someone beside him who knew how to map the structure of things before they broke. She had that now, and she was it for someone else now. Those two facts, held together, were the closest thing to peace she'd ever reliably known. On a late August evening, she was standing at the north fence watching Goliath at the pond, which he visited now with the calm routine of an animal who has stopped having to fight for what he needs, when Elias came up and stood beside her. The evening was long and warm, the sky going gold and then copper to the west, the cattle settled, the grass what it was after a dry summer, imperfect and sufficient. "He looks different," Elias said. "He's not worried anymore," Clara said. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Is that what it is? When an animal doesn't have to spend energy being afraid, it changes how they carry themselves." She watched Goliath lift his head and look across the water and then lower it again, unhurried. People, too. Elias looked at her. She looked back at him. There was a lot in the look, and none of it needed saying, because they were people who had learned each other's silences as carefully as each other's words. And the silence here was not empty, but full of the specific, earned weight of a year that had been harder and better, and more real than either of them had allowed themselves to expect. "Come inside," he said. "Supper's going to burn." "You're cooking tonight," she said. "I know. That's why it's going to burn." She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes without being planned. And they walked back across the dry grass toward the house with its blue-gray curtains catching the last light in the west window, and the smoke from the stove going crooked in the evening wind, and everything about it imperfect and theirs.